really excited to get to know you, Edith and Henry. And it's in fact, I like studying antiquity and the Middle Ages for some years, and so I'm really thrilled about the aspect, the thing that you want to bring back, where, and I read here, the authors challenge prevailing scholarship and popular assumptions that the study and appreciation of ancient Greek and Roman culture, history, and languages were the exclusive preserve of the intellectual elite and had no impact on working class lives. Marvelous subject, I think extremely relevant today, where we have, in a way, we're getting more and more away from respect and celebration of languages, our old languages, of the old cultures, and we're not integrating them with our lives as where we are now. So Edith Hall, I'll come to you first. Edith Hall is Professor of Classics at King's College, London, and is leading a campaign to introduce classical civilization and ancient history qualifications into state schools. Marvelous. She has published 30 books on ancient Greek and Roman civilization and its continuing influence, and in 2015 was awarded the Erasmus Medal of the European Academy. Coming to Henry Stead is a lecturer in Latin at the University of St Andrews, Scotland. His research project, Brave New Classics, explores the relationship between the Greek and the Roman classics and world communism. He's the author of A Cockney Catullus, 2015, title, a translator of Latin poems, marvelous, and co-editor with Edith Hall of Greek and Roman classics in the British struggle for social reform. Now, the thing is, you have just published, your book has come out together. You've published a book, came out 2020, and you're going to be telling us about the book, which lots of us will be dying to buy. So it's ahead for you, and welcome to everybody and for us to listen to you.
Thank you.
Should I share my screen? Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, well.
You can hear me. Okay, I shall start. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Greta. And I'm so sorry for the loss of somebody who was so important to this society. So this book that Henry and I wrote, it actually began life long before Henry was born, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford in 1978 to 82, and trying without very much success at that stage to make connections between my very traditional philological study of classics at Oxford and my lifelong interest in the labour movement. I wasn't particularly successful about this, but the book became inevitable actually during the miners' strike, when I met some miners, the 1984-5 Great Miners' Strike, and I met some miners from Mardy Colliery who told me all about the incredible tradition of miners' libraries in South Wales. Finally got funding after very, very long battles for some intensive research in archives, working class archives all over Britain and Ireland, which commenced in 2013, and was thrilled to get Henry on as my co-conspirator, as somebody who'd written this book about radical versions of Latin. I'm primarily a Hellenist. We were a perfect match. And I don't particularly like small poems, and he does. And it was originally intended to be open access from its inception. My own institution, King's College London, let me down terribly, having agreed to pay the book processing charge. It will be available free of charge in 2 years on the Routledge Taylor Francis website, free of charge. However, if anybody emails me, I will make sure that I can get them a PDF one way or another if they are unwaged or in student or need just poor, okay? So that's the cover and our frontispiece. The cover is a wonderful painting that we discovered in a Northumberland library, which I can talk about later, and the minor and the Roman are actually the banner of Lancaster branch of the National Union of Miners. Now, classics, which is the study of the languages and civilization of ancient Greece and Rome, is usually assumed to have functioned as the curriculum of the British elite. And this book really is the first substantial inquiry into the presence of ancient Greek and Roman culture in British and Irish working class communities. And we do hope it alters our understanding of the history of classics irrevocably. We start with the Bill of Rights in 1689 and come up to 1939, in each 250 years. And the evidence includes autobiographies, poetry, fiction, visual material culture, museums, galleries, the civic environment, theatrical ephemera, records of trade union activities, self-education publications, mass market inexpensive classic series, archives relating to poor, free, workers, adult and dissenting educational establishments, and archives relating to political parties that supported the working class. Now, there was a significant amount of engagement. I mean, this book is 200,000 words long, but most of it was very hard won by working class people. The time-consuming study of Greek and Latin languages was adopted as the core of classics, the education of the newly redefined British gentleman at the dawn of the 18th century, whether his fees were paid by landed estates or commerce. And it symbolized his fitness for prestigious profession, marriage into the gentry, a career in the civil or colonial service or government. And by the end of the second decade of the 18th century, the battle lines which still shape debates over the classics had been drawn up. Britons who were unable or unwilling to bankroll their sons, and it always was sons, classical educations fought back. The Greeks and Romans could be approached by other routes which didn't require years glued to grammars and dictionaries, which was of course impossible for anyone who was sending their son down the mine at the age of 7. These texts could increasingly be read in glorious mother tongue translations by great poets like Dryden and Pope, although reading it in the mother tongue was, of course, always derided by those with a financial interest in proving their superiority. The material covered in ancient authors even could be consumed by the completely illiterate in accessible entertainment such as the Siege of Troy, one of the most famous shows ever put on at Bartholomew and Southwark fairs. Now, section 1 of our book asks what classics-related cultural media and literary genres were accessed and used as vehicles by working class subjects. In the 18th century, some autodidacts in lowly occupations did succeed in learning classical languages way against the odds, while others accessed them in the increasingly abundant translations. In the 19th century, widening literacy and inexpensive mass market publications, especially those masterminded by the extraordinary John Cassell, expanded access to classics exponentially. Homer, Virgil, and Caesar were universally popular, but the authors prioritized by working class readers actually differed from those reading in expensive schools and elite colleges. Working classes read the Greek New Testament, Aesop, Plutarch, Epictetus, Josephus, Plato, Aristotle, and Livy, and a particular canon of historians of antiquity such as Rollin, Gibbon, Osborne, Ward. And those names recur on working class reading lists, and Henry's going to talk in a lot more detail about that in his 20 minutes. There were labouring class poets, both male and female, already in the 18th century, such as Stephen Duck and Mary Collier. And they publish collections which display really exceptional knowledge of classical forebears. And while some use it just to flatter their rich patrons, others do use it to challenge social injustice. Life writing by workers reveals a similar gulf between those who embraced what they perceived as their escape from their natal class and those who never ceased to work in its cause. But what unites all of them, and here are two of the most famous by Hugh Miller, Scottish geologist, who talked a lot about the influence of classics on his work, and the amazing trade unionist Ben Tillett, who was very much involved with what turned into the TGWU. Both of them talk about the impact that not knowing the Greek and Roman languages had on their development, and how reading them in translation had inspired them. And until the later 19th century, of course, a large proportion of the British working class, especially women, remained illiterate. And we explore their engagement with visual media, which informed them about classical sculpture and art and life. The windows of print shops, aristocratic and civic architecture and internal decoration, museums, spectacles, illustrated educational periodicals like the Penny Magazine. And since drawing, painted decoration, fan painting and modelling often attracted apprentices from very poor backgrounds, actually our visual understanding of sites such as the Athenian Acropolis and Pompeii, the pictures that have formed all of those images in our mind were very, very often drafted by men of working class origin. Theatre performances were also an important source. We've managed to find a lot of popular theatre on radical classical themes, especially two particular times, one sort of after Peterloo, stories about Brutus and Gracchus and other radical leaders of Roman Republic, and later new fictions like The Greek Slave, which have cross-class romances very radically in the run-up really to the Russian Revolution. Now, contact with classics varied between different communities, and although there's only two of us, we have tried at least to show some of the differences. Section 2 explores religious identity, adult educational groups, and the national experiences in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Dissenters of all denominations were absolutely crucial in making classical authors available to Britons across the lower end of the class spectrum, people like Gilbert Wakefield. And dissenters also often led major educational initiatives offering opportunities to the poor to study subjects which included classics, so mutual improvement societies, adult schools, mechanics institutes, university extension schemes, the WEA and the Labour colleges. These all have a chapter each. We're particularly fond of Plebs magazine, which was very interested in exactly the role that classics played, but also the role in the establishment, but also the role that it could play in the liberation of the working class. When it comes to Ireland, the relationship between the Irish and the Greco-Roman world was always intense, as their literature in both Gaelic and English reveals. Competence in Latin was fostered across even some of the lowest classes by Roman Catholicism and informal education at hedge schools. But political allegiances were very complicated. There were classically skilled Irish working class Catholics who supported Irish rebellion, but quite a lot who ardently opposed it. The two people that we're particularly interested in are Robert Tressel, author of The Ragged Trousers Philanthropist, which is of course incredibly important in Labour history. He was the mixed religious parentage from Ireland, and that book is fundamentally an allegory of Plato's allegory, a retelling in a working class context of Plato's allegory of the cave, this wonderful Platonic polemic. And also that there's a Protestant Irish weaver poet lady there as well. In Scotland, our major figures, Scotland had the proud tradition of the Ladder Perts, who boasted a long-standing reputation in Scotland for good working class education. And there were remarkable resources for the poor in the counties around Aberdeen, which furnished hundreds of educated men, often from very poor weaving backgrounds, to work in the farthest outposts of the British Empire. The Chambers brothers and other amazing Scottish publishers were particularly energetic in cheap and inexpensive publishing ventures, which included potted classics. And of course, Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present and other works are imbued everywhere with the myths of Midas and of the Sphinx. And Lewis Grassic Gibbon's Spartacus is a superb Scottish novel that translates Plutarch's story in his life of Crassus pretty much in ways that can be very much understood on Red Clydeside. And in Wales, we got particularly interested in the nonconformist tradition of classical education, but it also had Caractacus, the ancient British leader who, according to Tacitus, had fought against the Romans in Wales and was paired with Lloyd George in the public imagination. And there was an Edwardian craze in Wales for amateur theatrical performances like this in Welsh by school children and starring Caractacus saying no to the Romans. But sadly, they became very heavily involved in the recruitment drive and indirectly contributed to the terrible fatalities in Welsh communities in the First World War. In the third section, we look at some individual working class subjects, get away from communities to sort of some individuals. We've got a long chapter on the Democrats of the late 18th century, the journalists imprisoned in the aftermath of Peterloo, Chartists, workplace organisers and free thinkers. Some were absolutely working class, some were more prosperous, from more prosperous backgrounds, but who avidly supported the Chartist movement. A few outstanding autodidacts also began to harness classics to assist a meteoric rise to university chairs, usually with the aid of very rich patrons. And most of them, it has to be said, relinquished class anger to become quietist professionals. Not all. Richard Pawson, who was the Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge, was a notable exception. Joseph Wright, famously, who is the guy on the right of the picture as a mill worker in Saltaire, was illiterate till 15, but ended up with a chair of comparative linguistics at Oxford. We've also discovered a surprising number of vagrants and beggars who were learned. There's David Jones. Was it David Jones? Sorry, I've forgotten his surname. That Henry will recall, who Dirty Dick of Aberfan, he was known as, but who actually was the first person to do a Greek-Welsh dictionary and all sorts of other quite extraordinary things while living on the road. The culture and aura surrounding the ancient cultures didn't signify gentlemanliness and financial security everywhere. Alongside the gentry enjoying their Palladian mansions and expensive school curriculums, there always existed more commercial, demotic, subterranean and secretive groups in British and Irish society who used imagery from the Greek and Roman worlds. Salesmen, impostors, criminals, prostitutes, circus and fairground performers, showgirls, libertines, madmen and participants in recreations ranging from the merely vulgar to the totally illegal. Ancient Greek appeared in a variety of recherche concepts, such as accusations of witchcraft, caricatures of Jesuits, the slang dialects of criminal underclass, The displays of my favourite chapter of prodigiously intellectual dogs and pigs, fairground freaks, and divination and down market pharmaceutical and sex manuals. I'm particularly fond of citing Aristotle. And fairground, sorry, my cat's attacking my paper. Fairground performers, sorry, that picture on the right is of an extraordinary man's travelling booth theatre where he's playing a tragedy about Alexander the Great on a racetrack, beside a racetrack at Consett in the northeast. This is a wonderful chapter by Henry studies beauty and strength performers in the long 19th century. Dancers, actresses, strongmen, contortionists, strong women, wrestlers, boxers, artist models and posers of all kinds use draped fabric, famous statues, copies of famous statues and strips and straps of bared flesh to identify their acts with Greco-Roman antiquity. And they almost invariably came from working class or Roma families. The final section examines the presence of classical material in other working lives. The figures from antiquity with whom the working class identified, or with whom they were identified in sort of punch type cartoons, were male martyrs, rebels, slaves and labourers, and they were distinct from the heroes and gods instrumentalised up the top of the social scale, who were usually Aeneas, Augustus, Jove, Juno, Leto, Apollo, Diana, Venus and Mars. There were figures like Hercules who were used by both, and that's extremely interesting. Up there, I've given you a picture of a large number of trade union banners used Aesop's fable of the bunch of twigs, that you can't break the bunch of twigs that lie together, whereas you can one on its own, and that was for solidarity between unions. And we've discovered a huge tradition of Poseidon or Neptune and Amphitrite sort of processions in seaside towns in particular, and sort of masks, M-A-S-Q-U-E-S, about sea gods favoured by sailor communities. Certain professions were much more likely to attract working class intellectuals than others because they allowed for time. So tailors and shoemakers were particularly inclined to, and weavers, anyone who could prop up a book somewhere while they worked. So we find a large number of non-conformist shoemakers who were often like the local intellectual cultural leaders, and the shops became the talking shops for discussing the translations that working class people were reading. And I've got a whole chapter on pottery workers in Stoke, who, because they had to know so much about classical mythology and art, they were real experts on ancient art, especially the highest paid craftsmen at factories like Etruria, the Wedgwood factory. That's a vase that took an enormous amount of knowledge about different kinds of plate. It's got ancient vase types engraved all over it. Miners, of course, have to have a chapter all of their own. And Henry's done a fantastic job on the miners. Their incredible tradition going back to lead mills in Scotland in the first half of the 18th century's first workers' library of collections, which invariably included a large amount of classics in translation, as well as the sort of novels that people used, like The Last Days of Pompeii, Bulwer Lytton, and later things like Ben-Hur and so on. The novels set in antiquity were extremely popular. We've also looked at the tradition of miners' paintings. That's a Promethean figure. Prometheus is the enchained technological hero who gave fire to humanity as an altruistic act is very, very common in working class conceptualization of their plight. Then coming into the last 3 chapters, we have a whole chapter on the rise of the labour movement from about 1880 with the dock workers' strikes. Self-educated professional politicians then started to rise from the working classes, including Keir Hardie, who taught himself Latin and ancient history after 12-hour shifts down the mine. And they were then often joined by the women, often lower middle class, sort of vicar's daughters like myself, who were very active in the early days of the ILP, but had gone to read classics at places like Newnham and other women's colleges and Bedford and Royal Holloway. We talk a lot about especially the extraordinary communist intellectual Jack Lindsay, who was a superb classicist, who is read by people in the classics establishment, most of whom have no idea that where his politics were coming from. And I've done a chapter on the wonderful poem in parenthesis by David Jones, who's only one of the only 2 of the war poets who was not officer class. And his long epic poem in parenthesis is a heavily classical epic, but modernist in tone. It was much favoured by T.S. Eliot, about life from the absolutely always from the perspective of the lowest squaddy in the trenches. It's an absolutely searing poem, which has not got the attention it should have. It's both aesthetically much more interesting than the trite, Victorian-esque rhyming forms used by the officer class. And of course, it faces the full-on horror of rats and mud with far more style, but he imagines himself basically as somebody working in the lowest ranks of Julius Caesar's armies in Gaul. It's really extraordinary. And then Henry's done amazing work, our final full chapter, on Joan Littlewood and Ewan MacColl, whose theatre, they used communist theatre, the theatre workshop, used Greek drama to fight the cultural wars of the 1930s for the rights of the working classes. And actually even Oh, What a Lovely War is heavily indebted to Aristophanes' Lysistrata. And Henry has managed to dig up vast amounts of information about the MacColl and Littlewood Lysistrata, and also got hold of a lot of their secret files on them, because they were spied on very heavily, of course, as communists. So, in conclusion, my conclusion, the British working classes were almost universally excluded from institutionalized classics and from the study of ancient languages, but a few overcame the obstacles and many more engaged with the ancient Greeks and Romans in myriad creative ways. The classical world aided their careers, expanded their horizons, improved their rhetoric, helped them to write, paint, draw, sculpt, act, perform, teach, publish, organize trade unions, alleviate their boredom, join debating societies, read the Gospels in the original, and or question the existence of God altogether. They used classics to prove their intellectual caliber, to express their plight and signal their consciousness of the class system. But they also used it to subvert and undermine the authority of the classes that ruled them and to entertain themselves during leisure hours. The heroes of people's classics that we have disinterred were gardeners, stonemasons, circus acrobats, factory operatives, engravers, cutlers, domestic servants, brewers, weavers, tramps, beggars, prisoners, thieves, inmates of mental hospitals, clusterers, painter decorators, cabin boys, milkmaids, washerwomen, wall sorters, drummers, butchers, grocers, mechanics, carpenters, errand boys, tailors, pill sellers, janitors, porters, dockers, hatters. This is my favorite sentence in the book. Hatters, fishermen, sailors, comb makers, bakers, bricklayers, navvies, shepherds, threshers, and grave diggers who often dug up bits of Roman Britain. And they deserve, we think, very honoured places in the gallery of people's classics because they struggled so hard to get access to the ancient world. But we also hope that they offer us a new ancestral backstory for a discipline which Henry and I feel is still very sorely in need of democratization. So I just was trying to give my last slide there and I failed. Can you see it? No. Over to Henry.
Hello. I'll just share my screen now. Thank you, Edith. That was great, and thank you also to Steve and Greta for inviting us. I hope this will play now. Can you see that? Someone give me a thumbs up. Yeah, we're all right. Okay, good. Thank you. And yes, so Dirty Dick of Aberdaron, or Dick of Aberdaron, he was, it's quite hard to remember what his real name was because it's such a strong nickname, isn't it? But it was Richard Robert Jones, of course. So that just to clear that one up. Right, and I'm going to be looking in, sort of zooming in now onto the kind of the third chapter, but obviously in quite a condensed form. And it works, good. So in Britain, there is as we've partly seen, there is this long and proud tradition of learning about and experiencing the culture of ancient Greece and Rome via English translations and popular history, extending back to the late 17th century. Second-hand translations, school books, and encyclopedic reference works could be found on the market stalls or the hawker's basket at affordable prices. But the autodidact's journey to classical knowledge was not an easy one. By extraordinary determination, intellectual labor, and often a mix of fortune and going without, encounters between working class men and women and classical literature, while still extremely rare, became increasingly common throughout the 18th century. 18th and 19th centuries. So the results of this phenomenon from the 18th century begin to show themselves, for example, on the British popular stage and in broadside ballads of the long 18th century, as well as between the pages of those rare examples of labouring class poets picked up by shrewd publishers from the 1730s with the backing of aristocratic patrons. The best examples of such labourer classicists are perhaps the three shown here. From the left, there's Stephen Duck, the Wiltshire agricultural labourer, who became famous for writing this poem called The Thresher's Labour, and who took his own life, sadly, in 1756 after this ballistic social ascent to the royal court of George II via the patronage of his wife, Queen Caroline of Ansbach. Then we have in the middle Mary Collier, and I'm pleased to have found this picture because we couldn't find her for a long time. This is the washerwoman poet who corrected Duck's kind of masculinist view of labouring in her verse epistle, The Woman's Labour, by invoking, as she says, an army of Amazons to vindicate the injured sex. And finally, on the right there is Anne Yearsley, aka Lactilla, the radical milkwoman poet who was patronised in both sense of the word by the blue-stocking poet Hannah More. Now, in our people's history, we show the presence of the classical in their creative practice, a presence which has been previously kind of played down by historians who have preferred to foreground their less bookish compositions, which fit better into their notion of what a work of poet should look like. But today I'm going to concentrate on the 19th century because it was in the second half of this century that public and affordable access to educational resources improved really dramatically. Educational publications from the 1830s onwards provided a more guided route to classical culture than had existed before. The formal infrastructure with the Elementary Education Acts of 1870 and 1880, board schools, and an increasingly standardized curriculum raised the level of rudimentary education. And this was preceded and matched by the rapid evolution of a less formal and largely demand-driven infrastructure for self-education, consisting of public libraries, of adult educational establishments, reading rooms, educative and affordable publications, including cheap reprint translations of the classics. And this is Tom Barkley, born in 1852 to impoverished Irish parents. And he was one who witnessed and took up with enthusiasm these kinds of informal improvements I just mentioned. His father was a rag and bone man, and Barkley himself would work several jobs from an early age, including as a cardigan weaver in Leicester. And there was nothing the young Barkley liked to do more in his leisure time than to scour his collection of tattered and discarded school books for what he would later describe as the filthy loves of gods and goddesses. Now, the colourful depictions of sexual violence that scatter ancient Greek myth obviously captured the adolescent Barkley's fancy. But thankfully, later in life, his literary interests expanded somewhat. And he was a dedicated self-educator. He lived to found the Socialist League in Leicester. In his memoirs, he reflects how many a studious youth had blessed Cassell, John Cassell, for bringing out the Popular Educator. So the Popular Educator was just one of the several cheap popular educational periodicals arising chiefly from the 1830s onwards, which were specifically designed to give the vulgar people more knowledge for a penny than the lords used to have for a pound. Built on the earlier enterprises, as Edith briefly mentioned, in the southeast of Scotland, and Lord Brougham's Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, came publications such as the Penny Magazine, Chambers' Journal, and John Cassell's Popular Educator. Now, Cassell joked that the country is positively threatened, and this is the quote on this slide, is positively threatened with cooks, housemaids, nurses, footmen, grooms, mechanics, and peasants that will have more information, intelligence, piety, and morality than the king's lords, clergy, and gentry of the olden time. As a teenaged apprentice printer to the owner of the Cheltenham Journal, William Edwin Adams attended nightly classes and meetings. He founded a literary and debating society called the People's Institute. The first sign of his political awakening. He writes, "If I did not at that time educate myself," he's reflecting back on his past in the 1850s, I think. "I did at least the next best thing, I tried to." He recalls how English grammar was picked up from William Cobbett. The lessons in Cassell's Popular Educator afforded some insight into Latin. French was studied from the same pages in conjunction with another youth. So he found a friend to help him out. Although he believed that his reading of Tom Paine and attendance at lectures at the local philosophical institution had been more useful to his education. Adams moved to London in the 1850s and wrote for the Radical Press. In 1864, he was the successful editor of the Pitman's Bible, the Radical Newcastle Weekly Chronicle, and continued to educate himself. For Adams, most of the self-educated people of my age, his age, and of later generations owe a deep debt of gratitude to John Cassell. So Cassell was a big player in this. And Adams was not exaggerating. John Cassell, born in 1817, began life as a child labourer in a Manchester cotton mill and velveteen factory. He was apprenticed at 16 to a joiner in Salford. At 20, he walked away from the poverty of his childhood to London, married and opened up tea and coffee businesses. He ventured into the world of educational publishing, and he says, for the purpose of issuing a series of publications calculated to advance the moral and social well-being of the working classes. One of these was the Working Man's Friend and Family Instructor, established in 1850. From its inception, it aimed to deliver what was at the fireside of the working man to improve his evening hour after his day of toil. Cassell had become a vociferous advocate for mutual instruction, which took place in what he called the Operative Academy. Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and similar places are insignificant institutions compared with our workers' establishments. When boys or girls, men or women, go to any of these operative academies, they are not merely taught the art, trade, or mystery to which they are apprenticed, but there is a deeper and more important moral and intellectual education to which they are subjected. In 1852, Cassel launched his famous Popular Educator, which immediately became the staple reading of working class autodidacts. The alumni of Cassel's school, academy, and university include not only Barkley and Adams, who we've seen, but also Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the workhouse boy, who we have also seen, who became Oxford Professor of Comparative Philology, Joseph Wright. And there's another picture of him at the bottom on the left. So Thomas Bert was a Northumberland miner. He began working life as a trapper boy at Haswell Pit, but lived to become Privy Councillor to King Edward VII and father of the House of Commons. Bert considered Cassel's publication the chief handbook in self-instruction. He remembers sitting at the end of the table armed with the Popular Educator and a Latin dictionary, while with slate and pencil I translated as best I could the Latin lessons into English and the English into Latin. These Latin words with their English meanings I committed to memory. Now, Cassel cannot take the credit for the lessons in his Educator because he was not a classical scholar. The philological brains behind this entrepreneurial brawn of Cassel belonged to the Reverend John Relly Beard, a devout Unitarian minister. Now, Beard opened a school in Salford and later an important college for training Unitarian preachers. There's quite a lot of dissenting education in our book. He was a crucial force behind the movement for popular education in Lancashire. And at a time when other Unitarians feared that training ministers from the lowest classes would harm their cause, Beard never wavered in his zeal for universal education to the highest level. By the time he contributed the weekly lessons in Latin, Greek, and English literature to Cassel's Popular Educator, he had already produced Latin Made Easy, published in 1848, and several accessible works on biblical subjects. He demonstrated the true extent of his political radicalism by publishing a biography of the leader of the Haiti slave rebellion, Toussaint Louverture, and that's the frontispiece there. Bert's classical education was extensive, with only 2 years' worth of formal schooling. At 17, he embarked on a serious course of self-study. So we're back to Thomas Bert. Yeah, here he is. In addition to Cassel's Latin, he read widely in translated classical literature, including texts reproduced by one of the titans of cheap publishing, Henry Bonn. Now, before Bonn, buying new books would have been unthinkable for a miner on a miner's wage. His libraries, including his famed classical library of Greek and Roman classics, consisted of 600 volumes. And the Gentleman's Magazine opined in 1884 that it had established a habit in middle-class life of purchasing books instead of obtaining them from a library. But Bonn's inexpensive volumes, as Bert's case shows, were not only bought by the middle classes, they were also bought by the workers. To what extent is very hard to understand. But he remembers the stately, majestic march of Gibbon's periods had some attraction for me then, but the decline and fall, it must be admitted, was hard reading for an unlettered Collier lad, yet I plodded on until I finished the book, which beside its direct teachings brought me many indirect advantages. I've often wondered what he meant by these indirect advantages. I think we might come back to that later on. But Bond's contribution to people's classics goes even deeper. He pioneered the provision of translated literature to the Victorian mass market, thus proving instrumental in the democratization of reading. And Bond's classical library consisted of 79 titles, 116 volumes, and they were quite beautiful things, dark blue, with this kind of leather style and embossed. And you can see it there, which made them desirable to collect as well. Let's go on. So cheap book production reached fever pitch around 1830, when the provision of reading material for the newly discovered mass reading public was taken up by respectable London publishers. While their trashier competitors were symbolized by the ubiquitous and infamous penny bloods, and there's an example on the left, they specialized instead in improving and at first predominantly religious literature. The residual evangelical suspicions surrounding imaginative texts without an overtly Christian message faded though, and poetic and fictional non-copyright texts became a staple both of affordable periodicals and the mushrooming series of classics, such as this one on the right, such as the 6-penny Plutarch Lives, issued monthly by Ward, Locke and Co. In 1885 to 6. Great literature thus began to arrive in the homes of the British middle and working classes, and cheaper than Cassell's National Library, cheaper than many other, were these thin, wire-stapled and intentionally ephemeral volumes by W.T. Stead, no relation, in his masterpiece library. Stead brought out weekly pamphlets of penny poets and penny popular novels. The novels were digests of classic novels, and the poets reproduced selections from out of copyright English poets. They both, of course, sold for 1 penny, and sell they did, 11.5 million copies in a year. Stead was also newspaper editor, publisher, and social reformer, and aimed at enhancing the cultural range of the new reader, who is the product, he says, of the Education Act. His first issue was a penny's poet version of Thomas Babington Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, selling over 200,000 copies. And as Lockwood has noted, the fairly austere classicism of Macaulay's Lays was a conscious choice by which Stead created the maximum clash between lofty content and its cheap medium. But he also did children's books, like the Books for the Bairns, and this one, which he started with Aesop's Fables and then also included Stories of Ancient Rome. So this was an excellent way for children to become acquainted with the classics and receive at least some of the cultural capital that this knowledge afforded without having to spend years in the classroom learning it. Okay, so that brings us more or less up to the 20th century. When we meet Joseph Mallaby Dent here, whose Everyman Library, launched in 1906, took cheap reprint publishing and cross-class access to the Greek and Roman classics to another level. It was, they printed 1,000 titles in the first 50 years. And by 1975, I'm sure many people will be familiar with these books. So by 1975, more than 60 million copies had been purchased. And they became the staples of the WEA and the Labour College's courses. And yeah, as you can see here, just behind Dent on the right, there's an aristocratic couple reading in the garden of their rural mansion, and mirroring them on the left next to the boy, you can see a couple of workers. There's a pipe smoking butcher or a grocer, and a mechanic there with a big moustache. All 4 of these hold the same editions of Everyman's Library. dense pioneering series provided seriously high quality and well-produced literature at affordable prices, and they had a cross-class appeal. That's the message, and that's the reality really as well. Yeah. Okay, so now the amount of publishing of classical texts might suggest that through cheap vernacular classics, everybody was reading the Greek and Roman texts. But just because the texts were now within the workers' reach does not necessarily mean that they were bought and read by them. A cynical writer in the Academy observed in 1903 that the works of the great authors are regarded as part of the necessary furniture of the house, not the mind. But our book and Open University's Reading Experience database show that limited evidence of workers reading Everyman's classics does exist. Now, Richard Hoggett considered the kinds of autodidacts that occur in our book untypical members of the British working class. Working class intellectuals, he wrote, are exceptional in their nature, untypical of working class people. Their very presence at summer schools, at meetings of learned societies and courses of lectures is the result of a moving away from the landscape which the majority of their fellows inhabit without much apparent strain. They would be exceptional in any class. They reveal less about their class than about themselves. From the mid-19th century, however, increasingly favourable conditions for such exceptionality widened social engagement with cultural materials, such as the classical texts, which have traditionally, I think still are, considered to be the preserve, to an extent, the preserve of the expensively educated elite. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Stop.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. That was a marvelous journey through several centuries. Yeah, clap. Several centuries of literature. The way, I mean, I'm really fascinated and struggling with the words. I think what you've done an amazing amount of research to bring to light how much involvement of working people, working class people, as you said, washerwomen, milk ladies, shrubbers, and all the craftspeople have been involved and have learned from the classics. It's absolutely phenomenal. And it does remind me of actually our occasional paper book, which is coming out soon, where we're also looking at history in terms of literary people telling the history, and how much you're showing how people who are in the crafts, like the people, for instance, who use the classics to do the drawings on the trade union banners, you're saying, where they had to know the classics and the vases and all the things you're showing. So it's extremely fascinating, and it seems to take what you're telling. It seems to take history out of the just write something down about wars and kings and so on, amongst the people, which is, I think, that is really what we're needing to do. So I thank you very much, and I'll open it up now to people who may have questions to ask. Let's have a look. Okay, I've got a question here. Was from Mary Rowland, was William Stead WT edition of the Penny Gazette who supported women's suffrage?
Yes.
Do you want to say? And
he also ran an enormous campaign against child prostitution, a very successful one. He was very big on protecting young girls from being sucked into prostitution. Died on the Titanic, sadly.
Yeah, somebody says it went down on the Titanic. Do you think so?
Yes.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let me see. Steve, can you see any more?
We have 3 hands up.
Okay, we have David Murray's, I can see. David Murray, if you open up your microphone, we can hear you. David Murray, can you unclick your microphone, David? Okay. He's not. We can't unclick his microphone for him, can we?
No, we can't. There's a Lewis Blake Dagnall, a Gregorio, and a Zainab Said have all got their hands up.
Okay. Can we have? Could you name one person, because I can't see them here?
Right. Lewis Blake Dagnall. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Hiya. Firstly, thanks
Hello.
very much to the to both speakers and to the society for putting on the very interesting talk today. And it's it's such an important point, isn't it, about the argument that you're making? And I'm zooming in from Sheffield, and on our town hall is completely decorated with iconography. And yet it's amazing, isn't it, how we still have this association in mainstream culture, try to reinforce this association that classics is only for the elite and not for the working class, even though evidently, in cities like Sheffield, it wasn't felt like that in centuries past. I guess the question I wanted to ask, and it's slightly been devil's advocate, in full confession that, I'm doing a PhD in history of the later Roman Empire. I'm not here to denigrate classics, but the question that I was asked is that so the point that has been made around the working class classicists using their self-taught knowledge to subvert the 19th century and to some extent the 20th century British imperial elite. Some would say that was a very noble cause at the time, but that there's not much, that there's not resources within classics that make it relevant for the same socialist struggle today, because it was counter-hegemonic to that moment, but we've gone beyond that moment. So I don't know, and I know there's influence, there's very good movements here, particularly in the States, around black classicism and all of that. But I just sort of wanted to see if you could reflect further on the point about whether there's any intrinsic value in the classics beyond subverting elitist imperialist classics. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was a bit rambly, but yeah, is there any intrinsic value you thought for as a socialist in studying this? Thank you.
Henry, you go first.
Okay, yeah, I'll start. I think I'm holding Edith back here a bit, but I think my quick is that, yes, I think it's a really interesting point that you make, that it's obviously not so central now as it was to the education of all the people back in the 19th and 20th centuries. So as a kind of, are we therefore just kind of charging windmills? But I think the important thing to think about is that, in the classics, this is a massively broad kind of cultural body, and there is a lot of stuff that's intrinsically useful to your socialist movement now, I think, and partly that is that there are still those lessons of the past that we that can be forgotten, and we need to keep going back to the stories of Spartacus and the stories of Gracchus and all of that stuff. And that's never going to go old. That's going to keep coming back. And if we don't appropriate, if we do not take care of this knowledge arriving to us from the antiquity, then what we have is the right moving in and taking over our common cultural heritage. And that's probably the most important point I would make. And I'm sure Actually, can I just have one more moment? I think there is a danger, and I think this is why there is a bit of anti-classical feeling sometimes within the wider community, and that is because classics for such a long time operated, it was perceived to be kind of covering over or in competition with kind of local and indigenous and kind of folk kind of customs. And I think that dichotomy was really bad for classics. And but of course we can have both, and we don't have to have either or. So I will pass on to Edith on that. Thanks for the question, it's great.
Thank you.
This is very, I suspect, given you're a classicist asking the question, I suspect you're aware. I mean, this is an incredibly current issue. There's been some attacks by on the whole discipline because of its history, from always extremely well tenured Ivy League classics professors, I have to say, in the United States, who were actually calling for its sort of wholesale dissolution, to be very, very trendy. I find this really desperately sad. I'm perfectly prepared to say that I think that the intellectual advances achieved between about 700 BCE and about 300 CE were some of the most important in world history. And that does not make me a European colonialist or imperialist. These texts are extraordinarily important to the left wing of the European Enlightenment. They have been extraordinarily important to people ranging from Nelson Mandela, you know, to the Pankhursts. And that's because they're so good. And I would actually say I really believe in Greek philosophy and thought and literature as having made.
Thank you very much.
Brought about the Enlightenment mind. And I'm going to apologize for that.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have Zainab Syed with the hand up. Shall we have you?
Hi, thank you. Sorry. Firstly, I just want to say thank you both for your talk. It was incredible. I did manage to purchase the book, which I'm hoping to get reimbursed by a bursary, but I'm a classics student as well. My question actually came because I saw the just the image of, I think it was John Beard with the biography on Toussaint Louverture, and that was just I thought it was really cool, and I was just interested in sort of knowing about, because obviously the working class in Britain at the time was a huge proponent of the abolitionist movement and were huge proponents for anti-slavery, which was really, really wonderful and amazing. And so I guess I was just interested in knowing if they incorporate the classics into any of those like pamphlets or into any of those sort of arguments, and if you came across anything like that and incorporating classics into the abolitionist work or anything like that. Yeah.
I think I'd better take that one just because in an earlier book, I wrote published an edited volume called Ancient Slavery and Abolition, which is cross-referenced a lot in our current book. There are, of course, huge overlaps. Many of the people who were striving to liberate the British working class and women domestically were also working incredibly hard, both for the abolition movement and in other anti-colonial ventures. But having already done so much about that in this other book, and that book is free on my personal website, like most of my books. It's www.edithhall.co.uk, the books page. So there is an entire book dedicated to how classics were used both by apologists for slavery, for example, in the antebellum South, and by agitators. Again, a rich and fascinating story.
Excellent, thank you very much. We have Rachel Hopley next.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
My question is very, very similar to Lewis's, and I think I should also preface it with, I actually teach in quite a socially deprived school in Norfolk. I moved school since I met Edith in school in Suffolk, and I'm actually writing a thesis for my Master's in Education on potentially what classics can do for the most socially deprived in Britain at the moment. Very fortunate to teach it to some quite lower ability students at my school. And I just wondered, I've done quite a lot of research on cultural capital, specifically from Bourdieu, and I wondered if classics can still be considered cultural capital, especially since there's been lots of more research on emerging cultural capital, and there's much more of a focus currently in curriculum, especially on getting a job at the end of it. So I just wondered if you wanted to say anything on that. Thank you.
Okay, Edith.
Yeah.
No, take it away, Henry.
Yeah,
Henry.
yeah, thank you, Rachel. That's I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? I think yes, I still find it a really useful concept to think with. And even in light of Sam Friedman and Daniel Laurisson's great book, Class Ceiling, I think that it might even have increased in its, because as it's become more recherche, more of a protected, this is something we're trying to very hard to fight against, but there is a danger that the more obscure it becomes, the smaller the root, the more golden the ladder or something. You know, these things work in mysterious ways, and Sam and Daniel write about it much better than I can talk about it. But I think I've found the concept of embodied cultural capital particularly useful, insofar as it's often about displaying. It's not so much about what you know; it's about how you carry it. And like in an interview setting or in the workplace. And I think that when you've got this kind of slightly distant knowledge, but distant because old and distant because hard, and it takes you a while to learn it, you know. So that can create a kind of cultural confidence that from an early age that people can carry around, and that I still feel absolutely can be converted into other forms of capital, and I think is. So I personally find it but I'd be interested also to know why you question it, but maybe Edith would like to come in as well.
Thank you very much, Henry. I have two written questions here which came earlier. One is, did you look at the influence of William Morris and John Ruskins?
Yes, but because neither of those individuals were themselves working class, they weren't at the top of the list. Yeah. The impact of Morris on trade union art, usually via Walter Crane, was absolutely enormous. Ruskin also read a very, very great deal by working class people. He's one of the people that a poll of Labour MPs in the early days of the Labour Party, you know, he was up there on the list along with Carlyle. But again, he's exactly the kind of author about whom so much has been written that we always get this question. So we were trying to get away from the Richard Jenkins Victorian State in Greece to another level.
I think that's excellent, because you got to broaden it out and bring in all the people that are not being talked about. One more written question before we're going to go to David Murray in a minute, and this is how would you assess Hardy's Jude the Obscure within this tradition? Do you always get that one as well?
Yes.
Okay then.
It's all right. We write a lot about it in the book. It's interesting in numerous different ways, including the fact that he's actually sitting on a, well, you say, Henry, the bit where he's actually on the cart reading the...
Oh, yeah, gosh, I can't remember it word for word, but yeah, that's a bit, he's actually reading Latin, isn't he?
It's the Delphin edition.
Oh, that's right, yeah, a second-hand version of this particular kind of book with the marginalia, which kind of shows you how to read it in kind of prose Latin, how to read the poetry. I think that's right, isn't it?
It is. I mean, Thomas Hardy is everywhere in our book because his own very strained relationship. You know, he actually embodied this tension where he resented mightily the power of the classical establishment, and he had, like Jude, had not had his classical education, and yet wanted to be respected for how much he knew. So actually Hardy himself is to me even more interesting than his very many, and Jude isn't the only one. Pair of Blue Eyes, there's several other novels where there's a crisis moment revolving around classical literature, or lack of it, or the way it. But that's a very good question, and I read Hardy as a teenager before I, went off to do classics, and he was one of the authors who had the most impact on my life's project.
Thank you very much. We'll move to David Murray. You'll have to yeah. We can't hear you, David. No, we still can't hear you.
Maybe next time.
Hear me now?
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes? I'm good to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I have two strands of feeling about your wonderful book. One is a sense of being inspired and also humbled at your stories of people.
It's gone again.
No.
No.
Put it in the chat, David.
Okay, I will do that.
Yeah. Can I say that there is a Gregorio who's had his hand up for a very long time and been quite patient?
Okay, let's do that.
Hello, everybody. Hello, comrades.
Hello.
I'm Gregorio Carboni Maestri, and I'm in Brussels. I teach architectural history and project in Brussels, and I am a communist, a Trotskyist, and I come from a working class and a bourgeois family at the same time. My grandfather was a miner, and my other grandfather was a fascist, a bourgeois fascist builder. So I mean, and I try to work on the ideological structure of architecture, the built one, and the history of architecture. So I'm absolutely delighted with this work. I think it's absolutely what I want to do for history of architecture. I'm trying to do this since a long time. And anyone who wish to work on that, please. I mean, I'm open to anything that we can make together on that sense. So my question, obviously, and I'm really glad that you did the work saying that classical culture is important, because now in architecture, especially in Ivy Leagues, but in most elite schools, there is this discourse of no more Eurocentric, masculist history of classical. I mean, so I mean, this question is not on the table today, and I'm glad because obviously we must study all this. My father is a historian of slavery, of African slavery, Mario Maestri, and one of his first books made for the people, I mean, for the simple people, simple students in Brazil, was a simple history of a classical slavery. Although he didn't know Latin, and he had many problems because of this in Italy, for example, with camphor and so on. So my question is exactly on more or less, not only what David Morgan asked. I mean, Ruskin and Morrison, I thank you for the answer. That it's really a good answer. I mean, it is, but what about the relationship of the working class with classical architecture? Because I made a movie last year, Palladio, on Neo-Palladianism in the UK. And I made this documentary for the cinema for normal people, for the working class. I wish they can watch the movie and understand Palladio and understand history of architecture and the ideological structure of history of architecture. And we talk a lot about the UK because the UK bourgeoisie and aristocracy took Palladio, this architect from Veneto, for those who don't know, and he became kind of a model of Neo-Palladianism architecture that is more or less the official architecture of Victorian, regime and so on. So my question is, did you touch those issues in the book? I mean, what about the working class working on those buildings? I guess the working class had to build those buildings. And what about their relation with those symbols? Because this is what interests me. The column, the classical column, what did they had probably, like in the pottery that you showed, this relationship with classical architecture was probably very present in the working class, in the construction sector. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregorio. Please, who's going first?
Should I take this one? Yes, chapter 6.
Yes, Edith.
The one on the visual culture has got a very great deal about Palladianism and actually people building, the builders who had to build these buildings and the servants who had to walk their halls and the rest of it. But I've written a lot more about that actually in a book on the Raj, because there was a particular taste for Palladian buildings amongst people who'd made vast criminal fortunes in India, where they would actually build, and again, it's free on my website. It's called India, Greece and Rome. And there's some of the biggest National Trust properties in Britain, which are just beginning to acknowledge that they're almost all built in the 18th century on imperial money and slavery. But the Raj in particular, you would come back to Britain and outside of the building would all be Palladian or even other, the palace at Split, new Roman palaces were being dug up, which were imitated. But the insides, you put all your elephants' tusks in, but not on the outside. So there was this, you don't show the public the source of the wealth, but you gloat on it inside. But what you show the public is that you were a Hellenistic philosopher king, right? So I have studied that. But again, we were already at 200,000 words. I'm so thrilled that you're doing this, and I do hope we can carry on this conversation sometime.
It's that next step, isn't it, where you think, what is the relationship between the workers and those symbols?
Absolutely.
That's really hard.
Very hard. The other thing is that we had to draw the line. This is Britain and Ireland. England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. I desperately want the rest of the world to start looking at their different working class experiences of class. I know there is a huge story to be told in Germany, and there is certainly an even bigger one to be told in Italy. So I'm particularly pleased to have voices from outside Britain. We've had 2 already today, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, very wonderful. Thank you very much. Marvelous questions. I've got here somebody who is expressing 2 emotions. One, admiration.
Please write to me, Gregorio. Email me.
One, admiration for the work these people have done that you are talking about, and the other feeling, sadness for that this person is saying the culture is gone, and he or she is saying how to start a new culture of subversion. So I'll let you deal with that.
I think that one's for Henry.
Henry.
Poets. All your poets.
Yeah.
Subversion.
Oh, geez. Oh, how to answer that? I think I've been really. I was teaching last semester a people's history of Scottish classics, and I had was lucky enough to have a lot of quite a few Scottish working class students who were fully radicalized by this experience, and they absolutely loved finding their own experience kind of mirrored in the history. And I think, yeah, how to get it back is just by, I think actually by telling the stories is just a very simple way to remind people that, you know, this stuff is there to be used and to be enjoyed, but also, yeah, the using thing, it sounds a little bit kind of aggressive, but you know, we've got to be in the game, haven't we? Otherwise, I don't know how. I think just getting it raising, I think this, and Edith's doing a lot of work, and we're trying to do that up in Scotland too, raising it in the state sector, because otherwise these stories just don't get through, and people sometimes don't know what classics is, and that's a, you know, a thing that we'd really like to change, and hopefully.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think the enthusiasm with which you have told the story is an important part of it, to show passion for these marvelous things people are trying to stop to exist, because in a way we're living in a very strange culture of, you know, everything seems to be taken away from us. It gets reduced to just a minimum, and to a minimum moment of time, doesn't it? Because we're living in the now, we're not living in the past, and if you haven't got the past, you don't envisage the future. So by taking us right into this moment all the time, this is all being taken away from us. So the passion you have shown in your talk, I think, is very helpful. Any other there's Josephine.
There is a Josephine McEvoy.
That's one of my students. Hello.
Hello, Josephine.
Hello, Henry. Hi. Yeah, I was actually on Henry's module that he just brought up last semester. It was absolutely brilliant. One of the best modules I've taken at St Andrews. And so this semester I'm doing another class of module on applied classics, and I'm actually working on a project which basically uses my sort of Latin knowledge as to sort of create teaching plans for high school age students who don't necessarily have any Latin, in order to like take apart Latin like grammatical structures and basically teach children how to sort of discern truth and meaning in headlines, where, for example, you might want to see like, oh, what's in the passive, you know, just things like that. I wonder if perhaps Henry or Edith, you have any resources that might be useful for this project. It's about classical applications in general, so we're looking at loads of different ways in which sort of modern scholarship is taking that and putting books into like popular culture as well. So we've spoken with Helen Morales, who wrote Antigone Rising. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and yeah, it's been brilliant. So if there's anything that you have in terms of direction, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Shall I kick off, I guess? Yeah, that new project sounds great, but and there are quite a few projects that there's literacy through Latin that might be useful. People like Evelyn Bracker and who at Oxford, I think.
Arlene Holmes Henderson is the person to get in touch with, as she's at King's College London.
Yeah.
My colleague.
So thanks for that.
She's Scottish. Arlene Holmes, OLMES -Henderson.
Yeah, cool.
Can I say, Francis has got indicated that he wants a question.
Yeah. Okay.
Francis King.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sharing a computer. Just one thing, you mentioned a lot of this stuff came to these working class autodidacts through the translators. Can you say something about the people who did the translation, the selection patterns, and whether this actually kind of shaped what the classics were to working class autodidacts compared with what they were to the people who were studying them in the original classical languages in the seats of academic learning?
This is a really good question.
It is.
I think
it's
more.
Difficult.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Henry?
Well, just to say,
very difficult question, because actually there's a huge one. We often don't know who the translator is at all, especially in the 18th century. There's a vast amount of translation going on. In fact, people think quite a lot of it by women, sort of blue stockings making some money, but we haven't got the names. I mean, they're just out there, they're just published. Or the second is that you've got a sort of lapsed Oxbridge set. You've got a sort of dissolute bohemian set of people who went to a very minor public school, sort of didn't do very well at Oxbridge, and then sort of on Grub Street, incredibly poor, but they're not from a working class background, but they're incredibly poor, trying to make their living by, and we've got quite a few of those in the Bones Classical Library, for example, people desperately trying to make money. Then at the other level, you've got highly acclaimed poets like, you know, Pope and Dryden with their canonical translations that become classics in their own right. There are some who genuinely are from very working class backgrounds, especially in Scotland. There's somebody who translated all the medical writers very early, who was, you know, a shepherd's son, and so on. Have you got more to say on this one, Henry?
I think that's Altic, isn't it? The Altric shepherd.
Yeah.
That's the guy. What's his? Yeah, I forget his name actually as well. Sorry.
I think it's a very, very mixed bag.
Yeah, and like later on, with Jack Lindsay obviously translating Catullus, I'm really interested in how ideology translates into this, and there are interesting key moments where, you know, the ideology of the translator does have a big impact, and that when the ideologically neutral translators are working, which never is possible, is it? I think that's why a lot of our classics is actually very reactionary, very conservative, because it comes through these translations quite often from people with their own agenda, and often very out-of-date translations too, which doesn't help. Sometimes also through French as well. So this is the more working class translators quite often were, well, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, were quite often stealing the French translation, and people like, but then until the copyright forbade that. So. Yeah, but it's a really good, and that is such an important thing to look more closely into, and more work needs to be done. That's for sure.
Thank you very much. The history is written by the victors. Actually, have you looked at George Thompson's work? Because I think he is an exception in the sense that he actually goes back to the original language the Mediterranean cultures used, and takes the words back to their original meaning. I'm rather fond of George.
But George Thompson is a major figure in chapter 23.
Ah, I have to.
I actually, he had a huge impact on me because he was one of the classical authors. I mean, he was a brilliant Aeschylus scholar, the tragedian Aeschylus, absolutely brilliant. And Aeschylus is one of my major specialisms. He was one of the authors on the blacklist for people doing classics at Oxford in 1980. There was this blacklist, authors you must not read. And, you know, the fact that he had published with Lawrence and Wishart for a start, all his books came out with Lawrence and Wishart. And he was a huge figure in the Communist Party intellectual circles. And Henry's, he occurs several times in the book. I actually went to see him. When I was an undergraduate, I went to see all the old communist classicists I could find before they died and interviewed them. So I went up to Birmingham, and he'd gone completely bonkers by then. He'd fallen out even with he'd fallen out with the Soviet Union, he'd fallen out with Albania. Now he was learning Chinese, and he was a Maoist. You know, he never settled, but he was. I'm right now finishing an edition of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, and the best previous commentary is George Thompson's.
Yeah, thank you. I agree entirely.
There's a podcast that we made on the Classics website, yeah, for George Thompson. So
wow.
I'm talking with Kevin Morgan, Professor Kevin Morgan at Manchester, and Richard Seaford at Exeter. And so we chatted about his classics. But yeah, there seems to be a growing interest in George Thompson. And
well, he also translated, he was the first person to translate a whole set of Greek tragedies into Irish Gaelic. He taught himself Gaelic, went and taught at, I can't remember which university in Ireland, Galway. He was professor of Greek at Galway at the age of 24. Or so. And these are still the canonical, if you're an Irish speaker. I have an Irish speaking undergraduate. His first language is Irish. I didn't think there was such a thing anymore. He didn't learn English till he was about 6. And he was just so thrilled when I told him, yes, you can read Sophocles' Oedipus in Gaelic.
Marvelous. Well, can the podcast be seen or heard or whatever somewhere?
yes, on bravenewclassics.info, and it's in the listen section. Yeah, and I think, yeah, my colleague Michael Carroll is beginning a big project on George Thompson too, and he's got Irish and Gaelic, so that should be really illuminating too.
Fantastic. Can I remind everybody this talk is going to be videoed, is being videoed and will be available, so everybody can look up things that are being said and take the names down and start doing further research, because this is fascinating. Are there more questions, or where are we at with Steve?
There's a question from Aditi Singh in the chat, and Aditi has asked this twice, so therefore probably deserves to have it answered. Were there many working class stroke leftist readings and interpretations and receptions of classical text, apart from translations and editions of performances, that helped popularize the classics?
Okay.
Apart from all those things, well, is it leaping out to you, Edith? Because I'm trying to exclude two.
Yeah, there are several. Especially history books. So there's this guy that I mentioned at the beginning. His book, what was he called? Ward, The Ancient Lowly.
Mark Starr. Oh
no, there is Mark Starr.
The
Ancient Lowly is the American. I'm sorry.
Oh, Ward, isn't it?
Sorry, it's Ward.
Ward, yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole series of really important history books that focused on the bottom up in antiquity, standard reading. Are addressed in our book very much.
Oh, and in that tradition.
Sorry, I'm not remembering the names very well, having finished this book 2 years ago.
That's okay. Yeah, Daniel de Leon built on that, didn't he?
Yeah, Daniel de Leon.
Published his 2 pages of Roman history. That's the most brilliant and yeah, really fascinating kind of appropriation of Roman history. And it's very short, so you should try and find that. It's really interesting.
Could you say the name again, Henry?
Yeah, Daniel de Leon.
Leon.
L-E-O-N.
L-E-O-N. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Steve, how are we doing?
I think we've just about come to the end of it now.
Yeah.
And can I say, I think we've worked these people very hard. So I think they probably deserve the right to go and get themselves a cup of tea. And have
I'd like a cup of tea.
Or something stronger. Yeah, I think that it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. I feel so enthusiastic. I want to go jumping up and down now. So we're all going to take this forward. And I think this is broadening out and deepening the way we're looking at history. Thank you ever so much, both you speakers. And thank you everybody for attending and being with us. And Gregory, even from Belgium, from Brussels. Thank you very much. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
See you soon. Bye.